Thank you very much. Passing the error-prone baton. Let's see, do I have slides? No. Thank you very much for having me here. What the title of my talk today is Working Scared. And I want to talk a bit about psychological capacity and psychological safety. And a lot of people come up to me and say, what is psychological safety, or we have a problem with it, or our organization would never adopt psychological safety. But the truth is that psychological safety, you as leaders, it is your job to create it. And oh, wow, now it has double power. The reason why this is very important is because work is inherently unsafe. And you can think of it in terms of physical work, right? So what do we do when we work? When we work, what we're doing is we're changing something in order to create or extract value that is valuable and important to our survival. So we think about industries that meet our basic human needs, like the need for nourishment, agriculture, the need to be protected from the elements, the construction industry, the need to stay warm, the energy industry. These are some of the most dangerous industries there are. That work, that change, when you change something, you are trusting your belief in cause and effect. You think that if I do this, then I am going to get this outcome that I want. But the fact is that there is a range of outcomes that you could get when you change something. And some of those potential outcomes can hurt you. The same is about work that is the work that is social. It's not just, we don't just have physical needs. We have very important social needs. So in industries like the entertainment industry, industries that help us create a sense of meaning and belonging, they too are actually unsafe. We've learned that in New Mexico on movie sets, that movie sets are not these safe places. There's actually a lot of potential for physical harm, but there's also a lot of potential in our trying to seek getting our needs met, like a sense of belonging, for a lot of unsafe outcomes that are unsafe to our egos and are unsafe emotionally. So I might go up to someone and say, "Hi, my name is Martha," and they just, reject me, look at me funny, right? It is very unsafe for me to do this work right now. I'm an introvert. I used to tell Todd when I worked for him, when he would try and get me up in front of people, I would say, there is no Martha show, okay? There's no Martha show, because I didn't want, it was very unsafe to have that scrutiny where you judge me whether I'm smart enough or pretty enough or, whatever that is. And all of us we work through these periods in our psychological development where we're dealing with, are we enough? Are we enough to be loved? Are we enough to be a part of things? And change in itself is also inherently painful. So Edgar Schein says that people and organizations change when the pain of changing is less painful than the pain of staying the same. So whenever you are changing something, it is going to be painful. And so those of you who think, yeah, psychological safety is going to be really hard to talk about in my organization, it's probably because your organization hasn't fully embraced the pain that is work and that is change, and has recognized that that pain is an important part of learning. The double click's a problem. So let me ask you this question. What do termites, mole rats, and humans have in common? And there's some people in here who have heard this before, and know the answer. John, don't tell anybody. What is it? What do you think? What do they have in common? They all what? They all like to eat. I thought you said they're all good to eat at first. So I was like, what? So E.O. Wilson is the father of sociobiology, and he's a professor emeritus at MIT. And this is really controversial. But what he said is that, many organisms, we see evolution as we evolve as the organism. So we change and we mutate in order to deal with a different environment. But termites, mole rats, and humans evolve at the level of their societies, right? So our society, my interaction with you, how we build meaning to create organizations and power structures and roles and procedures, those are what we create in order to be able to survive in the difficult environment, which is our world, our changing environment. And it's very successful because it is much easier to change your behavior than to grow a new limb, right? So we can change our behavior and we can change our organizational structures in order to respond to situations. But this also creates a big emotional safety threat. Think about what are the things that terrify you at work. As a leader, you feel that your role is to ensure that a group of people perform in a certain way. And when they don't perform in that way, when that cause and effect belief doesn't hold to be true, then that's incredibly threatening. Which brings me to cowboys and buttheads, which is one of my favorite things. So I only worked at the lab for 4 years, and I came from Silicon Valley, so 4 years means I'm a lifer. But in the federal government, you're not a lifer until 40 years. You go to high school, and then you go to the lab, and you retire there, and all of that. But the most valuable thing for me was one of the most traumatic things for me, which was the lab shutdown. That cost, $370 million, but it was also incredibly valuable. And how it started, how we knew it was happening, was when the lab director, Vice Admiral Pete Nanos, stood up and called all the scientists at the laboratory cowboys and buttheads. And why did he do that? Was he just mean? Is he just sort of this villain in the story? No, it was his job to make sure that everybody was safe and that the nation's secrets were secure. And that wasn't happening. And that is incredibly threatening, to feel like you are responsible for something and you are powerless in making it happen. And so blame, which we are all trying to eliminate from our organizations. Blame is a natural emotional response to a threat, right? It's just deferral of or denial of a very emotionally threatening situation. So he blamed. He called everyone cowboys and buttheads. And of course, we understand reasons blame cycle. That blame led to people, to resentment and fear, and people not talking about what was going on and not sharing information, and things sort of spiraled from there. So think about other threats that we have experienced in our lives, and also threats to our business. How do we try and create a sense of certainty, right? We are betting that what we are, that our cause leads to some effect. We get information that things aren't as we thought they would be. Unexpected things happen. And so we try and comfort ourselves in a pile of toilet paper, as many people did at the beginning of the pandemic. The problem isn't uncertainty. You know, Todd talks about uncertainty a lot. Uncertainty just is. That really is the truth. We can't predict the future. We try really hard. I teach a class for American Express through Harvard that is all about how to analyze data. And so I give the examples between causation, the difference between causation and correlation and all of that sort of thing. But the fact is that causation is something that's very hard to prove. The example I give is, we do understand that a seed causes a plant, and people always come up, well, I've tried to garden, and I can tell you that a seed does not always cause a plant. So there's a lot of uncertainty in everything we do. The problem really is certainty, our need for certainty, our emotional attachment to certainty. And when we get attached to certainty, we stop learning. I have a very good friend, Kirsty Tyson, who's actually the person who introduced me to Todd and got me the job at the lab. We've been friends for years and years, and she's an expert on teaching math. And she's a professor. Well, she was a professor at UNM, and now she works for a research organization. And her research is all about the importance of listening when teaching math. And she says one of the problems with math is that there's a right answer. And once the teacher gives the right answer, or once somebody gets to a right answer, all conversation stops. All listening stops. And those people who didn't understand how they got to the right answer no longer have the opportunity to ask those stupid questions about, well, I don't really understand what you just did. They just go, oh, okay, well, there's the right answer. I guess I need to remember the right answer. So she encourages, and this is very hard in the education system, encourages not paying too much attention about the right answer. And probably some of you who are parents have encountered this, and you have gotten really, really mad about it. Like, what are you teaching my kids? There is a right answer. 2 and 2 is not 6. But it's really about spending more time with that uncertainty is really what allows us to learn. And in fact, learning by its nature is painful. So our neocortex, our prefrontal cortex, which is part of our neocortex, learns through trial and error. It's the typical scientific method. We're going to try something out, and if that fails, then we're going to learn from that failure. And we talk about that a lot. But the failure becomes part of that process. The limbic brain, which we actually share with all other mammals, so all furry creatures out there in the world, that learns through emotional intensity. So we engage with our environment. Our environment in some way hurts us, and that pain is what drives us to change our behavior, to adapt in order to avoid that pain. And then pleasure is really the emotion of reinforcement. So we encounter pain, we change our behavior until we get some pleasure, and then we stick with that pleasure until it's not pleasure. Well, not even until it's not pleasurable anymore, but until it's really, really painful. And then we change again. And in fact, studies show, those pop quizzes that you got in school that you really, really hated, those were the only really effective multiple choice tests because you got the answer wrong. And if the teacher told you the right answer soon after that, then that pain taught your hippocampus, which is part of your limbic system, to really remember that right answer. So it's, if you are going to become a learning organization, it's not about getting people out of their comfort zones. It's about staying in your discomfort zone. So how are you going to create a level of discomfort that is tolerable and also meaningful, not only in yourselves, but also in other people? So you heard about companies that talk about failing forward. And it seems kind of insane in a high reliability organization or in high hazard operations to create opportunities to fail. But remember, failure is not the bad outcome. Failure is something, is when you think something is going to happen and it doesn't happen, or something that you didn't expect to happen happens. It doesn't have to kill somebody. It doesn't have to hurt somebody. It doesn't have to cost a lot of money. It just means that you're pushing the envelope of certainty. So when you're failing, you're going outside of what you know and feel certain about. So when we just learn from failure by doing accident investigations, that little S curve is a learning curve. It's also an innovation curve. They're the same thing. And you start learning something new, and that little dip in the middle is that point where you struggle. That's actually where you learn, in that dip, when you're struggling. And then your performance goes up, which is great, and you love it. But then eventually your performance plateaus and then declines. It's not because you get bad at what you do. It's because you're living in a world that's changing all around you. And that particular tactic, strategy, behavior no longer is the best solution for what you're trying to achieve in the environment that you're trying to achieve it. You fail, right? And then you stop work, you do an investigation, you figure out, okay, here's what the failure was, here's the corrective action, we're gonna fix it. You start on a new learning curve and you fail. So, but you see here in that graph that your performance isn't improving. If you do what Whitney Johnson and Clayton Christensen at Harvard say to do, what you do is you disrupt yourself. You disrupt your operations, you disrupt your learning curves when you are at your height of success and performance. You start to anticipate, well, how are things changing? What are some of the things that I can do differently? And even if you can't fully anticipate it, which you can't, you can start thinking about, how can I start disrupting our operations in order to start developing new learning and new learning curves, and to allow us to see things from different perspectives. Maybe you can do a job rotation. Maybe you can put a novice in a job that's always been done by an expert. Maybe you can force an expert to try and explain their tacit knowledge to somebody who doesn't understand it. That's really, really, really hard. There's also, maybe you can put somebody in front, of a different power structure, bring somebody from the floor to talk to the executives. It'll scare the pants out of them, but they will definitely learn something. And that discomfort of breaking your power structures can be really helpful both to the worker and to the executives. So Todd talked about safety capacity. I think a safety capacity model is really helpful. This is how I understand it and how I break it down and where I put psychological capacity into it. How do you create organizational capacity for safety? Well, while you are dealing with strategic pressures and organizational change, you are adapting your organization. Your organizational is adaptable enough to maintain a safety envelope, even while the environment around you is changing, even while your organization is changing for whatever reasons, supply chain issues, access to workers, all of those sorts of things, the pressures that we all are experiencing right now. On an operational level, we are able to maintain barriers and controls, not maintain them the same, but maintain the same level of protection, even when hazards are emerging and error-prone conditions are emerging and conditions are changing. That's how you maintain safety capacity. You're able to adapt and respond to the change. The only way you can do that on an organizational and an operational level is to have psychological capacity, to have a team culture, to have a shared purpose, to be able to manage the meaning of the organization, because meaning is what drives understanding and behavior. And to manage your leadership mindsets that are going to promote the kind of openness, curiosity, and creativity that you need to be adaptable. You know, the curiosity that you need to be able to see that things are changing around you. And your brain is trying to keep you from doing it all the time. That's what bias is. Bias is a shortcut that's ignoring a lot of what it sees as noise in order to continue doing what it's doing as it's successful. In the way that we're built is to keep doing what we're doing until we get slapped in the face. Well, a slap in the face in your industries really hurts. It kills people, it hurts people. So you need to be able to give yourself a nice little tap before you encounter the thing that's going to really give you that huge pain. So psychological safety. Psychological safety is part of that capacity, but it is actually a very important, but it's a limited phenomenon. It's one of these things. There's culture, right? There's culture of the larger organization. There's your safety culture. There's your leadership culture. There's all of these other ways in which we create an environment where people can be curious and learn, but psychological safety is really important. It is the shared belief among a group of people that it is safe to take interpersonal risks, emotional risks, right? And it's really delicate. So let's say you have a strong safety culture, right? And that people do speak up and you're doing a pre-job brief and you know, the team leader is saying, all right, guys, well, so today we have a little bit of a change. We've had an OSHA regulation change. And so we have to do this particular part of the procedure differently. And so how we're going to do it is like this. And someone comes up and says, actually, you know, if we do that, there's going to be all of these other problems. And the leader said, yeah, the fact is that we don't have any control over that. You know, it's a regulation. We have to do it that way. So yeah, shuts them down. But you have a really strong safety culture, and this person's gonna continue. They feel pretty empowered to continue to speak about it and say, well, actually, no. You know what I want to talk about is there's this situation, and the team leader says, yeah, we can talk about that. We'll talk about it after the briefing, right? That doesn't just affect that person. They might be outraged. The whole team might be outraged because the safety culture says, wait, that was wrong. But there's still that power dynamic. There's still that moment of interaction. There's still the fact that got shut down. Nobody else, maybe, nobody else is going to speak up and going to continue to drive that fight. So that leader in that moment destroyed all of the work that you were doing around your safety culture, because it is leaders who create psychological safety. And it's not even formal leaders all the time. It is whoever is in charge of that particular interaction among that group where they are discussing their work and making decisions. So when we took, at the lab, when we took the IMPO human performance stuff and applied it, to the DOE complex, we got a lot of, we use James Reason blame cycle, and like, you are a bunch of hippies, right? Who you don't want to, we can't blame anybody. There's going to be no accountability. Workers are going to run amok. This bumper sticker made the rounds. This is what made Pete Nanos blow a gasket. Work-free safe zone. When we encounter new things like this, one of our natural psychological tendencies is polarized thinking. We create these paradoxes of work and these false dichotomies. Well, all right, you want us to be safe? Well, we're not going to be able to do our work because, hello, we work with nuclear material. That's not helpful. And I hear it coming up with psychological safety too. So let me tell you, there is no trade-off to performance or performance stress. So psychological safety actually lives at that high end of performance stress. When you are totally pushing your team to perform where you have very high standards, but you are providing those very high standards, and those very high standards need critical thinking and learning. You're pushing those very high standards, but you're doing it with compassion. And by compassion, I know I used a word that's also kind of hippie-ish, but compassion really just means that you have some empathy and understanding from their point of view. You're trying to understand their point of view. You're trying to meet the people in your team's needs. And you're trying to understand and deal with the emotional content or the psychological content that comes with the stress of needing to perform at a high level. So psychological safety is not a trade-off. In fact, it really shows the interdependency of leadership and performance stress. So the model for psychological safety, what Amy Edmondson talks about in her book, The Fearless Organization, are these 4 areas. And where these 4 areas come from is when she does her research, she has 6 items in a climate survey for the team, and then how people answer that is what determines the level of psychological safety. And this is what you're looking for. A healthy attitude towards risk and failure, a sense of strong inclusivity and belonging, and the evidence of people being willing to help and also being willing to ask for help, and open conversation about difficult and contentious things. So these are the indicators that you have psychological safety within a given group. So here are the things, here's your task. How can you shift attitudes towards risk and failure to build the capacity to adapt to uncertainty and change? And what you talked about yesterday, I mean, the pandemic taught us a lot. You didn't even have to disrupt your teams. The world disrupted your teams and forced them to adapt and become more comfortable with uncertainty and change. One important thing to remember is failure, like error, is normal. It's normal for you to do something, try and change something with an idea that when you change something, this is how it's going to behave, and that not to happen. Or for you to expect conditions to be in a certain way and those conditions not to be that way. Failure is just something happens that's unexpected, or you get an unexpected outcome of from an input that you give. And like error, like human error, it's totally normal. So we don't have to love it. We don't love the fact that we're, error-prone creatures, and we don't have to love the fact that we can't totally control our work, but we have to learn from it. We have to figure it out. We have to adapt to it. We have to bring it into our understanding of how we design and manage operations. This model comes from Michael Roberto at the Bryant University. And the way that he looks at it is a lot of times we have to recognize that people are doing all different kinds of work all the time. So routine, well understood work is going to have less uncertainty and fewer failure incidents, or less of a failure rate. But it's really important to look at those failures, because failures are an indicator that there is some organizational or operational or cultural blind spots that you need to pay attention to. That routine, well understood work needs to change. That learning curve needs to change. In the variable, uncertain, and complex work, there is more uncertainty, but that's more expert-based work. You guys know that term. And that expert-based work means that you're relying on that expert to be able to understand all of the different variations of the way that you do that work. You're going to have higher failure rates with that higher uncertainty, but that also those failure rates are expected and planned for, because you're relying on the expertise around that work to be able to mitigate many of those expected failures. And then there's the, pure science. Some of you are doing work around that, where actually failure is a mechanism for discovery, and you're really driving that. You want to drive into the novel and the unknown. You are seeking high uncertainty in your work, and therefore you get really curious about failure, and in fact, you're trying to create it. So when we look at failure this way, it's not such an enormous threat. Inclusivity and belonging is really important. Todd talked yesterday about how important all kinds of diversity are to problem solving. And of course, Catherine Phillips is the person whose work was really seminal in understanding that diversity is really important to performance. But there's a problem. Diversity is terrifying for us. And what happens many times, even just considering ourselves sort of diverse people, is that we tend to hide it. We cover, we change our appearance, we deny or change our affiliations. We don't advocate for people or for groups that are different, even though we identify with those groups. We don't associate with them. I've always had this issue. I'm Colombian, culturally Colombian. I'm of mixed race, and that didn't make any sense to anybody in Texas when I grew up. I spent my life people telling me, "What are you? What are you?" And that, of course, creates, I totally identify with all of the different ways that I cover. I get upset when I go to Miami to see my mom and people talk to me in English. And I'm like, why do people think I speak? Of course I speak Spanish. And she's like, no tienes la pinta latina. And I was like, oh man, that kind of hurts, that I don't like people. I've tried to fit in so well in my life that I have completely disassociated with my cultural heritage. And, and it's really been, it's been an interesting learning journey to take that pain and try and figure out what I'm going to do with it. But the fact is that the reason why this is a very real phenomenon isn't because there's anything wrong with people, but because, going back to E.O. Wilson, not belonging is an existential threat. Our being part of an organization and belonging in it and having a role and knowing what we're to do for our role and understanding what success means and how we're going to be measured and know what success and failure, that is what actually keeps us alive. That is how we evolved to threats. So not having even an inkling that we're too different to belong is very hard. But again, that diversity is so important to learning and problem solving. And so this is a research from Henrik Bresman and Amy Edmondson, where they went to 62, they looked at 62 development teams within the pharmaceutical industry. And they found that diverse teams that didn't have strong psychological safety and not a strong sense of inclusion and belonging, they didn't perform very well. You know, people were covering, there's lots of different ways in which we hide our diversity or don't engage in it. A lot of times we get experts together. Have you guys ever had a tiger team to solve a problem? You get an expert together, and the phenomenon is that those experts don't share their expertise. They just talk about what they know in common because they're trying to belong and build camaraderie and stuff. And they don't feel, because there's not a lot of psychological safety, safe saying, well, actually, you know, I'm an expert in this, and this is what you don't know, Dr. So-and-so, I'm Dr. So-and-so, you Dr. So-and-so don't know this, right? People don't do that. We don't go into that. But the reason why you hire these people and you put them all together is to share their unique knowledge. But we don't do that if we don't have a sense of inclusivity and belonging. The next one that's really important is willingness to help. And I think more, it's sometimes willingness to ask for help. All of you have heard about fixed and growth mindset from Carol Dweck. You know, a fixed mindset is that, you know, you believe that talents are innate gifts, and growth mindset, you know, you believe that people can be developed. And everyone says, well, of course I have a growth mindset. We don't have a fixed mindset in this organization. This makes perfect sense. Except there's lots of reasons why we don't do it. We don't go here. You know, we still talk about hiring the right person for the job, right? Well, that's very much a fixed mindset idea. You know, having the right stuff, all of those sorts of things keep sending this messages, this meaning to people that if I screw up, it's because there's something wrong with me. And so that opportunity, and then even development, even being trained becomes a punishment that they're wrong. I mean, one of the things that kind of drove me into safety was, you know, showing up to be the, you know, to do training at a nuclear facility, and then seeing this stack of corrective actions where I was supposed to retrain people on a procedure. Some of them wrote themselves, but somehow retraining them on the procedure was the corrective action for them making a mistake. I was supposed to somehow fix the people, and learning wasn't this experience. It was this club that we beat people with to say, you're an idiot. You might be the world's renowned expert on, you know, nuclear lasers, but you're an idiot because you can't follow your own procedure. So we're going to put you back in remedial training with the crazy training lady. So, but here's the thing. It's really just the way that our brain works. We are, in trying to protect ourselves, we have these limited thinking patterns, right? The self-limiting thinking. Psychologists have identified this for a long time. One of them is polarization. There's a right way and a wrong way. You know, you're either a safe organization or you're a high-performing organization. You know, here's the only thing that matters. All right, everybody listen. There's one thing that matters. All I want you to think about is this when you go out into the field. Well, no, that really limits your possibilities about what people can think and what they can pay attention to. Generalization about people. Yeah, I mean, a lot of you work with trades, a lot of you work with unions. it's really easy to get into generalization because you've been in those meetings, you've been beat up. They have a certain identity, like different groups have identities that they carry around with them and they portray, and it forces these generalizations, but they are not helpful. It is not helpful for you to go into a union negotiation with an idea of what you think the union wants and doesn't want. That completely limits the possibilities of your negotiation. But we all do it. This is a natural human function, like way that our brain works. And it actually takes a lot of work to question these things. And, I have a little workbook. I'm showing you that workbook will help. The final thing that I want to talk about is open conversation. And this is one that, nobody disagrees with, right? That we want people to be able to speak up. Lauren, I know, but that's a pretty dangerous thing to do, to speak up and to engage in healthy conflict. It's really helpful to safety. And Robin Ely, she's a gender researcher. So she goes out and she looks for gender stereotypical behavior. And she, stumbled across our field. And she found, she went out to look at oil platforms because she was looking for hyper macho behavior. And she went out late 90s. And what she found at first was this first quote, the person who is on charge is the person who can outperform and out-intimidate everybody else. She said there were literally fist fights to get the top job. And I forgot what the name of the top job is. Some of you probably know. But then when she came back, she found that people were talking about the importance of speaking freely and troubleshooting and, not getting, and she was like, wait, what happened? I was studying macho guys. Where did my macho guys go? And it turns out they had a huge safety change initiative sometime in 2004. And it really changed people's attitudes about, being able to talk openly about what they were worried about. And they had a decline in their incident rate by 84%. Her research doesn't give us numbers that, we would particularly be interested in. Specifically, you can ask me all day what they were measuring. I don't know. It's not in her research. She doesn't know because she doesn't know what that means. But the fact is that we can change the way that we respond to criticism and attack if we just try and figure out what's the feeling, the emotions, and the need behind that attack and that message. So my advice to you is, if someone insults you, lean in and get curious and ask, tell me more. So this has happened to me before. Early when I first took the job with Harvard, I was with a bunch of friends and I was explaining what I was doing. I'm delivering corporate leadership development programs through Harvard. Oh, okay, sorry. I'm going to put this down. And somebody just said, "Oh yeah, classic example of those who don't do teach." And I was just like, well, what? And I took a moment, and then, I thought I had a lot of outrage, but then I just said, "Oh, that's interesting. What do you mean by that? Tell me a little bit more about that." And then, well, you're not a leader, so how do you teach leaders? And I'm like, I guess, I was once a manager. I was like, well, that's not the same, right? And I was like, oh, yeah, okay, well, no, actually, you're right. Leadership and management really isn't the same. And so I engaged in a conversation, and one of the things that he brought up is like, well, it's different leading people than it is leading organizations. And then leading an organization, you're dealing with driving sort of organizational outcomes, and you're being forced to make decisions all the time with very limited information. And if you haven't done that, you don't know how difficult that is. And I said, yeah, you're right. And this was several years ago, and that it's actually super valuable to me, because now I'm on the board of 2 organizations and I have leadership positions on those boards. And he was absolutely right. It kind of sucks to be sort of the person who is in charge of decisions around the organization and then not really managing anybody but the CEO reports to the board. And not really getting involved in the operations of things. And it gave me a whole new insight into the challenges of the people that the people that I teach have. So, and that's I think the key thing here is how we cultivate our empathy. And there's different kinds of empathy, and people misunderstand empathy a lot. But what is important to develop in yourself is curiosity, vulnerability. And I know vulnerability is a hard word, but what vulnerability does is just for you to let down your strong ego defense, which is a normal thing. You should have an ego. You should maintain your ego. You just don't want to have an ego that wants to attach to everything. But that vulnerability just lets you go, maybe I can actually understand how somebody feels, even if I'm the person who hurt them. There's a lot of defense if you unintentionally or intentionally hurt somebody. You have a very hard time trying to empathize with their pain, but you can. And that kind of vulnerability, being the enemy in that person's emotional situation at the time and letting yourself be a vulnerable enemy is actually an incredibly powerful thing. People who, fire have to let go, people learn that very quickly or don't. And it either becomes a very useful experience to fire somebody, a very enlightening experience, or it becomes a hideous one. And then, empathetic concern, which is this compassion, which is understanding, having a sense of what somebody else might need from you. And of course, the fundamental skill in empathy is listening, not necessarily, sometimes to get someone to tell you something, you kind of have to guess, put out a hypothesis there. Is this what you're thinking? Is this what you're feeling? And you really want to give them the opportunity. What you really want is no, that's not what I'm feeling. What I'm feeling is this. But that's an important skill to learn. There's lots of skills that are hard. So here's where we're getting at. These are some of the questions. Todd said, what's important is questions. These are some of the questions that you need to look at when you look at your organization. And Linda Hill talks about roles, procedures, communication, and measurement as being 4 important levers to culture. Because, culture isn't a thing that you create. You make a poster about what you want it to be, you put it on the wall. Now, woohoo, we have a culture. A culture is something that grows up from behaviors, from meaning on the ground level, and that becomes something persistent that makes people feel this is what we do around here. People start to identify around it. So these are the 4 areas. Oh, boom, I wanted to be there. Again, putting it down. Questions are, do we have roles that are limiting identity? So Lakshmi Ramarajan talks about the importance of having complex identities, allowing you to bring your complex identities to work in order to be able to respond to ambiguous, complex, changing situations. Do those roles create power structures that inhibit expression? Do our procedures create a false sense of certainty? Is that something that might be inhibiting learning? Do you only communicate what you know? Is communication hierarchical? And is information power? These are the sorts of things in measurement. Are metrics being used for blame and punishment, or even reward, which people, reward is just the other side of blame and punishment. Are you focused on outcomes, and is success, this is a positive thing. You want to link success to purpose. Are we linking our success to purpose? Or are we just linking success to the short-term metric? These are all the questions that you need to ask yourself to start building psychological capacity. And here are some things that you can do. I mentioned Lakshmi Ramarajan's research embracing multiple identities, empowering learning over status. When you're looking for roles, don't just look for a role independently, but look for the relationships, include collaboration and experimentation into your process, really talk about the importance of empathy and inquiry in communication, and incentivize learning as much as you incentivize certain performance measurements, and don't get seduced by outcomes. Change your metrics so that those metrics aren't so important. There's a million ways to measure an elephant, right? But you might get stuck on 3. Try and switch those up. Switch up what metrics you're paying attention to tell you where you're going, or to give you information, so that you aren't limiting the view on where you're going. So that's my advice for you. Nothing that I said is easy. If something is simple, especially when it comes to leadership, it's usually really hard to do, and it requires you to do a lot of reflection and work. So I'm not giving you a quick answer, but hopefully I'm giving you something that's valuable to think about. Thanks.